The sun had already set over the dusty frontier town, casting long shadows across the wooden buildings that lined the main street. The wind was cool, carrying the smell of the dry earth and the distant scent of cattle. In the heart of the town there was a small rowdy saloon. The smell of whiskey and tobacco filled the air, and the sound of clinking glasses mixed with the murmur of low conversations. It was here that Caleb Hawke found himself on this particular evening. Caleb wasn't much for company. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by years of working the land, he preferred the solitude of his cattle ranch far outside town. He'd never been one for the comforts of city life. His ranch, located on the outskirts of the town, was his world. It was all he knew. So when the opportunity to make a little extra money came up, Caleb didn't hesitate to walk into the saloon that night, drawn by the sight of the high-stakes poker game taking place. It wasn't a friendly game. The players were all men with rough faces, weathered by years of hard living. Caleb didn't care. He had his own reasons for being there. A good hand of poker could be the difference between another lean year and the chance to upgrade his ranch. As he walked through the door, the chatter of the room fell to a hush. His presence was enough to silence most conversations, his reputation preceding him. At the poker table sat a man Caleb knew well, Eamon O'Leary, a gambler whose reputation was as dangerous as it was legendary. Eamon's dark eyes flicked up when Caleb entered, a small, amused smile curling on his lips. He was the one who ran this game, and he was known for making impossible bets. Caleb nodded in his direction and took a seat without a word. But it wasn't just Eamon who drew Caleb's attention. Sitting across from him, almost out of place in the rough, dusty saloon, was a young woman. She had a striking presence, her auburn hair catching the dim light of the saloon. Her green eyes sparkled with intelligence, and despite the grit of the place, she carried herself with a quiet grace. Caleb noticed that she wasn't looking at the cards or the men around her, but instead had her eyes locked on Eamon. She seemed out of place, too refined for this rowdy crowd. Siobhan O'Connor. Caleb had heard the name in passing, but he didn't know much about her. All he knew was that she wasn't from around here. She had an accent that gave her away, a soft, melodic Irish brogue that seemed almost too delicate for the harshness of frontier life. The game began, and Caleb didn't waste any time getting into the rhythm. He didn't need to talk much, just focused on his cards and the players around him. The other men at the table were good, but Caleb had an edge. Years of living on the ranch had taught him to read people, and tonight he knew he had the advantage. He played slowly, allowing the others to raise the stakes, and slowly he began to win. As the hours passed, Caleb found himself facing off against Eamon and Siobhan in the final hand. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. It was down to the last bet, and the stakes were high, much higher than just money. Eamon looked at Siobhan, his eyes narrowing. "Do you understand what's at stake, miss?" Eamon asked, his voice smooth but carrying a hint of warning. Siobhan didn't flinch. Her eyes met his without fear. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied, her voice calm, though there was a steel edge to it. Caleb couldn't help but admire her composure. She wasn't afraid of this man, even if she was clearly in a dangerous situation. Caleb focused on the cards in his hand. It was a risky move, but he had no choice. He couldn't back down now. He pushed all his chips forward, his face a mask of concentration. Eamon chuckled darkly. "You sure about that, Hawke?" he asked, his grin widening as he saw Caleb's confident move. Siobhan glanced between Caleb and Eamon. There was something in her eyes now, a flicker of recognition. She had no love for Eamon, that was obvious, but it also seemed like she was determined to make it through this no matter what. Finally, the cards were revealed. "Looks like I win," Caleb said quietly, his hand holding a straight flush. Eamon's expression froze for a moment before he masked it with a forced smile. "You've won, Caleb," Eamon said, his voice low but edged with frustration. "But what do you plan to do with your prize?" Caleb blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Eamon nodded toward Siobhan. "According to the rules, the prize is hers. She's yours now." It took Caleb a moment to realize what Eamon meant. This wasn't just about money. Siobhan, as part of the bet, was now Caleb's responsibility, his prize. She wasn't a possession, but the way Eamon said it made it clear that he thought of her that way. It was a cruel, twisted game that Caleb hadn't fully understood when he agreed to play. Siobhan stood up, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You think you can just take me like this?" she demanded, her voice cold. Caleb felt a wave of guilt. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to win a person. He had simply wanted to win the game. He looked at her, meeting her fierce gaze, and for the first time, he saw beyond the calm exterior. He saw the fear and the anger. "I don't know what your plans were, miss," Caleb said slowly, "but I'll make sure you're safe. No one's going to hurt you. I won't let them." But Siobhan wasn't listening. She turned away from him, refusing to meet his eyes. "I don't need your protection. I don't need anyone's help." Her words stung, but Caleb didn't take offense. He understood her anger. She had been through something terrible, and now she was stuck with a man she didn't know or trust. He had to admit that he didn't know much about her either, but he wasn't going to leave her to fend for herself. Without another word, Caleb stood up, ready to leave the saloon and take her to his ranch. The only thing he could offer was his silence and his actions. He hoped that in time, Siobhan would realize that he didn't intend to take anything from her. He wasn't like the men who had put her in this position. As they left the saloon, the door swung shut behind them, and Caleb could hear the murmurs of the other gamblers inside. He didn't care. He didn't care about anything except getting Siobhan away from this place. Siobhan didn't say a word as they walked out into the night. The stars above were brilliant in the clear sky, and the wind was cool against their skin. It was a long walk back to the ranch, and neither of them spoke as they made their way through the darkened town. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. But Caleb knew one thing. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't just about the game anymore. It was about protecting someone who didn't want to be protected. It was about earning trust where none had been given. And somewhere along the way, he knew they were going to have to find a way to survive this strange and twisted bond between them. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the sprawling ranch. Caleb Hawk stood on the porch of his small wooden house, staring out at the vast fields that stretched endlessly before him. His cattle grazed lazily in the distance, their low mooing blending with the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees. Life on the ranch was simple, quiet, and predictable. But ever since that night in the saloon, things had changed. Siobhan O'Connor, the woman Caleb had won in a poker game, had become part of his world, whether he wanted it or not. She had agreed to come with him, but there had been no gratitude in her eyes, only wariness and anger. Caleb didn't blame her. She didn't know him, and he didn't know her. They were strangers, thrown together by a twist of fate that neither of them had chosen. As the days passed, they kept their distance. Caleb worked the land, and Siobhan spent her time around the house doing whatever needed to be done. She was no stranger to hard work. Despite her delicate appearance, Siobhan was tough and resourceful. She didn't hesitate to grab a shovel or a rake, and she learned quickly how to handle the chores around the ranch. Caleb watched her from a distance, admiring her strength, though he said little. But there was always a wall between them. Siobhan's eyes were often filled with suspicion, and she rarely spoke unless she had to. Caleb didn't press her. He understood the need for space, especially after what she'd been through. But in the silence, he couldn't help but feel a pull toward her. There was something in her quiet strength that intrigued him. One evening, after a long day of work, Caleb sat at the dinner table, the flickering light from the oil lamp casting shadows on the walls. Siobhan sat across from him, her eyes fixed on her plate. The silence between them was thick, like a weight they couldn't shake off. Caleb sighed, setting his fork down. "Siobhan, I know this ain't what you expected when you came here," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "I never meant to make things harder for you. I don't know what your past is like, but I promise you, you won't find any harm here. You're safe." Siobhan looked up at him then, her green eyes sharp and calculating. For a moment, Caleb thought she might argue or push him away, but instead she nodded slowly. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I don't need your protection, Caleb. I'm not some helpless girl who needs saving," she said, her words soft but firm. "I can take care of myself." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He understood her pride. It was something he shared with her. But he couldn't deny that he had taken her in because he felt responsible. Whether she liked it or not, she was now under his roof, and it was his duty to make sure she wasn't hurt. "I'm not trying to control you, Siobhan," he said, his voice low. "But there's a difference between taking care of yourself and surviving. You've been through a lot, I can tell. And if you need help, I'm here. No questions asked." Chauvin looked at him for a long moment, her gaze softening just slightly. Then, without another word, she stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit land. Caleb watched her, wondering what she was thinking. But she didn't speak again that night, and neither did he. Days turned into weeks, and the uneasy tension between them slowly began to fade. They were still far from being friends, but there was a mutual respect between them now. Chauvin had proven herself more than capable on the ranch, handling everything from feeding the cattle to fixing fences. Caleb had to admit she was more than he'd given her credit for. She wasn't the helpless woman he'd assumed her to be. Yet, despite the calm between them, Caleb could feel the storm brewing. He knew Eamon O'Leary hadn't forgotten about her. Caleb had seen the look in Eamon's eyes the night he lost the poker game. It wasn't just the money that mattered to the gambler. It was the control, the power. And now Caleb had what Eamon considered his. One afternoon, as Caleb worked the fields, he heard the sound of horses in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. He knew it wasn't just any group of travelers. The riders were too well armed, their horses too fast. It was Eamon's men, and they were coming for Chauvin. Caleb quickly made his way to the house, his mind racing. Chauvin was inside, out of sight for now, but she wasn't safe. Not while Eamon was out there. He reached the porch just as the sound of hooves grew louder. The men were close. He took a deep breath, preparing for the worst. He knew this wouldn't be an easy fight, but he wasn't going to let them take Chauvin. Not after everything they'd been through. Chauvin appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She'd heard the horses too. They're here, aren't they? She asked quietly. Caleb nodded, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle. You need to get inside. Stay out of sight. But Chauvin didn't move. She stood tall, her eyes burning with the same fire Caleb had seen in the saloon. I'm not hiding, Caleb, she said firmly. They're coming for me, and I'm not going to run. For a moment, Caleb hesitated. He wanted to keep her safe, to protect her from whatever was coming. But he knew that Chauvin wasn't the kind of woman who would run and hide. She wasn't afraid to face what was in front of her. All right, Caleb said, his voice steady. Then we faced them together. The riders appeared on the horizon, their dark silhouettes growing larger by the second. Caleb and Chauvin took their positions, Caleb in front, ready to defend the ranch, and Chauvin beside him, a determined look in her eyes. This wasn't just a fight for her freedom. It was a fight for their lives. When the riders finally reached the ranch, they didn't waste time. Eamon's men dismounted quickly, pulling out their weapons. But Caleb was ready. He had the advantage of the land, and he used it well. The terrain around the ranch was perfect for a quick escape, and Caleb knew how to move quickly, using the rocks and trees to shield himself. Chauvin was beside him, her rifle steady in her hands, ready to fight. She had grown into this life more than Caleb could have ever imagined. They weren't two strangers anymore. They were partners, bound by a shared purpose. The gunfire rang out, sharp and fast, echoing across the fields. The men who had come for Chauvin were no match for the two of them. Caleb's aim was true, and Chauvin moved with the kind of precision that surprised even him. In the end, Eamon's men were forced to retreat, their plans foiled. But Caleb and Chauvin knew this was only the beginning. Eamon wouldn't give up so easily. As the dust settled, Caleb looked at Chauvin, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. They had done it. Together. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. Chauvin turned to him, her expression softening for the first time in weeks. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice sincere. Caleb gave a small nod, his usual stoic expression in place. No need to thank me. We're in this together. And as the moonlight bathed the ranch in a soft glow, they stood side by side, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.